The conference room fell silent as Brandon Walsh, our new director, pointed directly at me across the mahogany table. "Your position has been terminated effective immediately," he announced with a cold smile. My colleagues stared at their laptops, avoiding my stunned gaze. 3 years of dedication, countless successful projects, and this is how it ends. "You've been a bottleneck long enough, Annabelle," he continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction. I gathered my dignity, pushed back my chair, and stood. Just as I turned toward the door, a familiar voice spoke from the back corner. "Actually, Brandon, I think we need to talk." 6 months earlier, my life at Sterling Technologies had been everything I had worked toward since graduating from Northwestern University. Growing up in a small Colorado town called Cedar Ridge, I never imagined I would one day lead innovative projects for one of Chicago's most prestigious tech companies. My childhood was spent helping my father repair farm equipment, while my mother balanced the books for local businesses from our kitchen table. They taught me that honest work and creative problem-solving could overcome any obstacle. The scholarship to Northwestern felt like winning the lottery. Business and technology courses opened worlds I never knew existed, but the real education came from struggling through those first few years in Chicago. After graduation, I bounced between 3 different startups in the city, each one teaching me harsh lessons about corporate politics and the fragility of innovation in competitive markets. My 4th position took me to San Francisco, where I joined a failing startup called Innovate Corp as a junior analyst. The company was hemorrhaging money during the dot-com crash, and morale had reached rock bottom. Senior developers were abandoning ship weekly, leaving behind half-finished projects and frustrated clients. During my 3rd week there, while reviewing our main security product, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The software had a massive vulnerability that could allow hackers to access our clients' most sensitive financial data. Worse yet, the flaw was so deeply embedded in the system's architecture that fixing it would require rebuilding the entire platform from scratch. When I brought this to my supervisor, he dismissed my concerns, claiming the deadline pressure was more important than theoretical security risks. That night, I stayed in the office until 3 a.m, developing a revolutionary patch that not only eliminated the vulnerability, but actually strengthened the entire system's security framework. My solution required restructuring the database connections and creating a new encryption protocol that would make the software virtually impenetrable. When I presented my work the next morning, the room erupted in excitement. The patch not only saved the company from potential lawsuits, but transformed their failing product into the most secure financial software on the market. Within 6 months, Innovate Corp went from bankruptcy to industry leadership, with Fortune 500 companies lining up to license my security innovations. What I didn't know at the time was that our mysterious new investor, who had purchased 60% of the company just weeks after my breakthrough, was actually Robert Sterling, operating through a shell corporation. He had been quietly tracking promising young technologists across the industry, and my innovation caught his attention in a way that would shape both our futures. Over the following 5 years, Sterling continued monitoring my career progress from a distance. When I moved back to Chicago and joined a mid-sized consulting firm, he somehow knew about the client retention system I developed that increased their renewal rates by 38%. When I briefly worked for a nonprofit organization optimizing their volunteer coordination platform, he was aware of how my improvements helped them expand their community impact by over 200%. The recruitment process to Sterling Technologies felt completely natural at the time. The hiring manager, Patricia Williams, seemed genuinely impressed by my track record and spoke passionately about the company's commitment to innovation and employee development. During my final interview, she mentioned that the founder himself had specifically requested to meet candidates for senior positions, though Robert Sterling never appeared that day. My first 18 months at Sterling Technologies exceeded every expectation I had built during my career. The company culture celebrated creative thinking and collaborative problem-solving in ways I had never experienced. Sarah Chen from the marketing department became my closest workplace friend, bonding over our shared love of hiking and our similar experiences navigating corporate environments as young women in tech. Michael Rodriguez, the technical lead, initially viewed me with skepticism, but gradually became one of my strongest supporters as he witnessed my coding abilities firsthand. We spent countless hours refining algorithms and debugging complex systems, developing a professional partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Jessica Martinez managed client relations with a warmth and professionalism that made even the most difficult customers feel heard and valued. She often sought my input on technical questions from clients, and I appreciated how she always credited my contributions during presentations to external partners. My breakthrough project involved developing a comprehensive client management system that revolutionized how Sterling Technologies tracked projects, communicated with customers, and allocated internal resources. The system integrated seamlessly with existing software while providing real-time analytics that helped department heads make informed decisions about staffing and timeline management. The results spoke for themselves. Company-wide efficiency increased by 47% within 6 months of implementation. Client satisfaction scores reached all-time highs, and employee productivity improved dramatically as administrative burdens decreased across all departments. Industry publications featured articles about Sterling's innovative approach to customer relationship management, with several competitors attempting to replicate our model. Robert Sterling himself sent a company-wide email praising the client management system and specifically acknowledging my leadership in its development. That recognition felt like validation of every late night and weekend I had invested in perfecting the platform. Within 18 months, I received a promotion to senior project manager, becoming the youngest person in company history to lead major initiatives. The industry awards followed naturally. The Chicago Technology Council recognized me as an emerging leader under 30. Business journals published interviews about my approach to balancing technical innovation with practical business applications. Conference organizers invited me to speak about creating user-friendly systems that actually improved workplace efficiency rather than adding complexity. Everything seemed perfect until the corporate restructuring began 6 months ago. Sterling Technologies had grown rapidly, and Robert Sterling decided the company needed more experienced leadership to manage its expansion into new markets. The announcement about bringing in senior executives from established firms initially felt exciting, like an opportunity to learn from seasoned professionals who had guided other companies through similar growth phases. I remember the optimism I felt preparing for Brandon Walsh's arrival, researching his background and imagining how his expertise from TechFlow Industries could complement our existing team's innovative energy. Looking back now, that naive excitement feels almost painful to remember, knowing how thoroughly Brandon would exploit my trust and dedication in the months that followed. Brandon Walsh arrived at Sterling Technologies on a crisp October morning, carrying himself with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and closing major deals. At 42 years old, he possessed the kind of strategic thinking and industry connections that smaller companies desperately needed to compete with corporate giants. His credentials were genuinely impressive. During his 7 years at TechFlow Industries, he had overseen their expansion into 3 new market segments, increased their annual revenue by over 400%, and successfully negotiated partnerships with several Fortune 100 companies. His LinkedIn profile showcased testimonials from former colleagues praising his ability to transform organizational efficiency and maximize human capital potential. The introductory presentation he delivered to our entire company was masterful in its blend of vision and practicality. Brandon spoke about streamlining operations to eliminate redundancies while preserving the innovative culture that made Sterling Technologies special. He acknowledged our recent successes while pointing out opportunities for improvement that would help us compete more effectively with larger firms. During the question and answer session, Brandon addressed each concern with thoughtful responses that demonstrated deep understanding of both our industry and our specific challenges. When Sarah asked about maintaining work-life balance during periods of rapid growth, he shared examples of policies he had implemented at TechFlow that actually improved employee satisfaction while increasing productivity. Most of our team left that presentation feeling energized about the possibilities his leadership could create. Even I found myself genuinely excited about working with someone who seemed to understand both the technical and business sides of our industry so thoroughly. His approach felt like the perfect complement to our existing strengths. My first private meeting with Brandon took place 3 weeks after his arrival. He had requested one-on-one sessions with all department heads to better understand our current projects and long-term objectives. When I entered his office, he greeted me warmly and immediately referenced specific details about my client management system that showed he had studied my work carefully. "Annabelle, your innovation with the client tracking platform represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we need to expand," he said, gesturing toward charts displaying the efficiency improvements my system had generated. "I'm particularly impressed by how you balanced technical sophistication with user accessibility. That's a rare skill in our industry." He spent nearly an hour asking detailed questions about my background, my vision for future projects, and my thoughts on Sterling Technologies' strategic direction. The conversation felt collaborative and respectful, with Brandon treating my opinions as valuable input rather than subordinate feedback. When the meeting concluded, he mentioned his intention to recommend me for promotion to department head within the next quarter. "You have the technical skills and leadership potential to guide our entire development division," he told me as I prepared to leave. "I want to make sure you have the authority and resources needed to implement your ideas on a company-wide scale." Walking back to my office, I felt a sense of professional validation that I had never experienced before. Having someone with Brandon's background recognize my contributions and advocate for my advancement seemed like the natural progression of my career trajectory at Sterling Technologies. However, subtle warning signs began emerging during our weekly department meetings. Brandon's questions about our proprietary client information seemed oddly specific and probing in ways that made me slightly uncomfortable. He would ask about password protocols, data encryption methods, and backup storage locations with a level of detail that felt unnecessary for strategic planning discussions. During one particularly memorable meeting, Brandon casually requested that I share detailed client access codes with him for security auditing purposes. While his explanation sounded reasonable, something about the request felt inappropriate. Our existing security protocols required multiple authorization levels for accessing sensitive client data, and Brandon's position didn't technically require that level of system access. I politely explained our current security procedures and suggested routing his request through our IT department's formal approval process. Brandon accepted my response graciously, but I noticed him taking extensive notes during my explanation in a way that seemed inconsistent with routine management oversight. My growing unease intensified when I began observing Brandon's behavior during my presentations about upcoming product launches and development timelines. He would ask me to elaborate on technical specifications, market research findings, and client feedback in ways that seemed designed to extract as much proprietary information as possible. The first concrete evidence of suspicious activity came during a late evening in November when I returned to the office to retrieve files I had forgotten. Walking past Brandon's office, I noticed his computer screen was still active, displaying what appeared to be email correspondence. Though I only glimpsed the screen for a few seconds, I clearly saw references to Sterling's weaknesses and opportunities in correspondence with addresses that appeared to be from TechFlow Industries. That discovery prompted me to conduct some discrete research into Brandon's background and TechFlow's recent activities. What I found was deeply troubling but difficult to prove conclusively. Over the past 2 years, 3 other TechFlow executives had left the company to join competitor firms in senior leadership positions. Each of these transitions had been followed by significant client losses and strategic setbacks for their new employers. More concerning, TechFlow had systematically acquired the client bases and intellectual property of 2 smaller companies within months of placing executives in leadership roles at those firms. The pattern suggested a sophisticated corporate espionage strategy designed to weaken competitors from within while positioning TechFlow for strategic acquisitions. Faced with this information, I found myself in an impossible position. I had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, only suspicious patterns, and my own observations of Brandon's probing questions. Meanwhile, Brandon had already established himself as Robert Sterling's trusted advisor, regularly meeting with the founder to discuss strategic initiatives and organizational improvements. My attempts to voice concerns were met with subtle dismissal and redirection. When I mentioned feeling uncomfortable about some of Brandon's information requests, during a casual conversation with Patricia from operations, she suggested that I might be overthinking routine management inquiries and advised me to focus on my assigned responsibilities. Brandon's first act of sabotage occurred in December, presented as an unfortunate oversight that perfectly illustrated the systemic inefficiencies he had been warning about. During a routine client communication, he accidentally shared confidential technical specifications with the wrong department, causing a minor security breach that required immediate damage control. The incident was handled professionally, with no lasting impact on client relationships or company operations. However, Brandon used the episode to justify implementing additional oversight procedures and questioning existing security protocols that I had helped develop. He positioned the changes as necessary improvements, while subtly suggesting that current systems were inadequate for our growing company. Recognizing the potential threat Brandon represented, I quietly began implementing additional security measures and documenting any suspicious activities I observed. I created backup copies of critical project files, enhanced password protection for sensitive systems, and started maintaining detailed logs of all interactions involving confidential information. Unfortunately, my defensive measures coincided with Brandon's escalation of his undermining campaign. He began questioning my decisions during public meetings, suggesting that I might be resistant to necessary changes and overly protective of legacy systems that needed updating for organizational efficiency. The isolation began gradually as Brandon systematically influenced colleagues' perceptions of my reliability and team compatibility. He never directly criticized my technical abilities, instead focusing on concerns about my adaptability during transitions and my communication style during stressful periods. These subtle character assassinations were particularly effective because they contained just enough truth to seem credible. I had indeed been more cautious about sharing information, and I had become more reserved during meetings as I tried to navigate the increasingly complex political dynamics Brandon had introduced to our workplace. By January, Brandon's strategy for discrediting me had evolved into a comprehensive campaign that targeted every aspect of my professional reputation while systematically stealing my innovations for his own advancement. The sophistication of his approach was both impressive and deeply disturbing, revealing years of experience manipulating corporate environments for personal gain. The first major theft involved my revolutionary client retention algorithm, which I had spent months developing to predict and prevent customer attrition before it occurred. The system analyzed communication patterns, project satisfaction metrics, and usage data to identify clients who might be considering switching to competitors, allowing our account managers to proactively address concerns and strengthen relationships. During a February board presentation that I was not invited to attend, Brandon presented my algorithm as his own creation, describing it as a strategic innovation developed through comprehensive market analysis and predictive modeling. He received enthusiastic praise from board members and client representatives, with several industry publications subsequently featuring articles about his groundbreaking approach to customer relationship management. When I learned about the presentation through Sarah, who had helped prepare some of the supporting materials, I felt a combination of rage and helplessness that was unlike anything I had experienced in my professional career. Brandon had not only stolen months of my work, but was receiving public recognition for innovations that could define the trajectory of his career advancement. More insidious than the theft itself was the gaslighting campaign Brandon launched to undermine my confidence and credibility. During team meetings, he would reference conversations we had never had, suggest that I was misremembering project details, and imply that I was becoming overwhelmed by the complexity of my responsibilities. "Annabelle, I'm concerned that you might be taking on more than you can handle effectively," he said during one particularly humiliating meeting in front of our entire development team. "Yesterday you seemed confused about the timeline for the Morrison project, and last week you forgot to include the client feedback analysis in your status report." Both accusations were completely false, but delivered with such confidence and concern that colleagues began nodding sympathetically. Brandon's ability to create alternate versions of reality was so skillful that I sometimes found myself questioning my own memory of events, wondering if stress had somehow impaired my attention to detail. The manipulation extended to my relationships with longtime colleagues as Brandon systematically turned trusted teammates against me through private conversations that twisted my actions and motivations. He told Sarah that I had been spreading rumors about his leadership style and creating unnecessary drama during the transition period. Sarah, who had been my closest workplace friend for over 2 years, began distancing herself from our regular lunch meetings and casual conversations. When I asked her directly about the change in our relationship, she suggested that I might be going through a difficult adjustment period, and advised me to focus on supporting the team rather than questioning leadership decisions. The betrayal was devastating because Sarah had witnessed Brandon's inappropriate information requests firsthand, but chose to believe his narrative over her own observations. Her willingness to abandon our friendship based on his manipulation showed me how effectively he could exploit people's desires to avoid workplace conflict. Michael's recruitment to Brandon's coalition was even more calculated and painful. During a private meeting, Brandon offered Michael the department head position that had originally been promised to me contingent on his willingness to support organizational restructuring that would optimize our technical leadership. Michael, who had once respected my coding abilities and collaborated with me on numerous successful projects, began undermining my contributions during team discussions. He would interrupt my presentations, suggest that my approaches were overly complicated for practical implementation, and redirect conversations toward solutions that aligned with Brandon's preferences. The professional betrayal was compounded by the personal disappointment of watching someone I had mentored and supported abandon our collaborative relationship for the promise of career advancement. Michael's transformation from ally to adversary showed me how Brandon could exploit even strong professional relationships when individual ambition outweighed loyalty and integrity. Meanwhile, Brandon continued stealing my work with increasing boldness and sophistication. Project files and innovation records began mysteriously disappearing from shared servers, always during weekend hours when technical support was unavailable to investigate. When I reported these incidents to IT support, they attributed the losses to server maintenance issues and suggested that I should maintain better personal backups of important documents. The documentation disappearances were strategically timed to coincide with project deadlines and performance evaluations, making it difficult for me to prove my contributions or defend my work quality. Brandon would reference missing deliverables and incomplete project files as evidence that I was becoming unreliable under pressure. Client relationship destruction became Brandon's next focus as he systematically removed me from communication channels and decision-making processes that I had helped establish. He told our major clients that I was being reassigned to internal projects and that he would personally handle their accounts to ensure consistent service during our organizational transition. Jessica Martinez, who managed client relations and had previously valued my technical input, began routing all communication through Brandon rather than including me in discussions about system improvements or troubleshooting. When I asked Jessica about the change, she explained that Brandon had streamlined communication protocols to eliminate confusion and improve response times. The exclusion from client interactions was particularly damaging because those relationships represented years of trust building and collaborative problem solving. Many clients had specifically requested to work with me on technical issues, but Brandon's intervention severed those connections while positioning himself as the primary technical resource for Sterling Technologies. Performance review manipulation became Brandon's method for creating official documentation of my supposed inadequacies. He scheduled my annual evaluation during a week when he had deliberately assigned me an impossible deadline involving 3 separate project deliverables that normally would have been distributed across different team members. When I inevitably struggled to complete all the assignments to his satisfaction within the artificial time frame, Brandon documented the experience as evidence that I was unable to manage multiple priorities effectively and struggling to maintain quality standards under pressure. The evaluation became part of my permanent employment record, providing formal justification for any future disciplinary actions. The false accusations escalated throughout the spring as Brandon planted evidence suggesting that I had been accessing unauthorized systems and potentially compromising data security. He created login records showing attempts to access client databases outside normal business hours using technical vulnerabilities in our system architecture to make the evidence appear legitimate. When IT security investigated these incidents, they found no evidence of actual security breaches or inappropriate data access, but Brandon used the investigation itself as proof that my behavior had become concerning enough to warrant formal scrutiny. He positioned himself as a responsible manager who had identified potential risks before they could harm the company. The social isolation deepened as colleagues began avoiding informal interactions with me, believing Brandon's narrative about my negative attitude and resistance to change. Lunch invitations stopped coming, casual conversations became awkward and brief, and team social events somehow never included me in planning discussions. Working alone in my office, I dedicated my evenings to researching Brandon's background and TechFlow Industries' corporate history. What I discovered confirmed my worst suspicions about his true agenda and Sterling Technologies' vulnerability to corporate espionage. Two previous companies where Brandon had worked as a senior executive had experienced remarkably similar patterns of employee departures, client losses, and eventual acquisition by TechFlow Industries. In both cases, key technical talent had left within months of Brandon's arrival, taking proprietary innovations and client relationships with them to competitors. The pattern suggested that Brandon's placement at Sterling Technologies was part of a systematic strategy to weaken our company for eventual acquisition. His campaign against me was not personal vindictiveness, but professional calculation designed to eliminate employees who might recognize and resist corporate espionage activities. Armed with this research, I prepared a comprehensive presentation documenting Brandon's suspicious activities, the pattern of similar incidents at his previous employers, and the specific instances where he had stolen my innovations or manipulated colleague relationships. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling, painting a clear picture of systematic corporate sabotage. Unfortunately, I had no platform to present this information. Brandon had successfully isolated me from key decision-makers and positioned himself as Robert Sterling's primary advisor on personnel issues. Any attempt to challenge his credibility would be dismissed as desperation from an employee who was struggling with performance issues and organizational changes. The final trap was being set, and I could see its outline clearly, even though I was powerless to avoid it. Brandon scheduled a department efficiency review for early March, positioning it as a routine evaluation of team performance and resource allocation. However, his private comments to colleagues suggested that major personnel decisions would result from the meeting. As I prepared for what I knew would be my professional execution, I reflected on how systematically Brandon had destroyed my reputation, stolen my work, and turned colleagues against me while positioning himself as a concerned manager trying to help a struggling employee. His manipulation had been so skillful that even I sometimes questioned whether my perceptions were accurate or distorted by stress and paranoia. The night before the meeting, I sat in my apartment organizing evidence that I knew I would never have the opportunity to present, watching 3 years of dedicated work and professional relationships disappear under the weight of Brandon's calculated campaign of destruction. The morning of March 15th arrived gray and cold, with an early spring storm coating Chicago's streets in a thin layer of ice that made every step feel precarious. As I walked into Sterling Technologies that Tuesday, the weather seemed to mirror the treacherous professional landscape that Brandon Walsh had created around me over the past 5 months. I arrived at the office 45 minutes early, hoping to use the quiet time to review my notes and prepare mentally for what I knew would be a devastating confrontation. However, Brandon had anticipated my strategy and was already in the conference room when I passed by, arranging materials and speaking quietly with Patricia Williams from operations. Their hushed conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed me, and Brandon offered a smile that managed to be both professional and predatory.
Good morning, Annabelle. I'm looking forward to our discussion today about optimizing our department's effectiveness,
he said in a tone that made my stomach tighten with anxiety. The meeting was scheduled for 9:30, but Brandon had clearly been laying groundwork for hours before my arrival. As other colleagues filtered into the office, I noticed them clustering in small groups, whispering and glancing in my direction with expressions that ranged from pity to uncomfortable curiosity. Sarah passed my office around 8:15, offering a brief wave that felt forced and awkward compared to our previous easy friendship. Michael arrived shortly afterward, avoiding eye contact entirely as he focused intently on his phone while walking past my doorway. The isolation Brandon had orchestrated over the preceding months was now complete, leaving me professionally and socially vulnerable to whatever he had planned. At 9:15, I gathered the materials I had prepared for the meeting documentation of my recent project contributions, client satisfaction metrics, and copies of the innovations that Brandon had stolen and claimed as his own. While I knew these materials would likely prove useless against Brandon's predetermined agenda, maintaining my professionalism felt like the only dignity I could preserve. Walking toward the conference room, I passed Brandon's office and overheard him finishing a phone call with someone he addressed as Richard. The conversation included references to eliminating obstacles and finalizing the transition timeline, phrases that confirmed my suspicions about the meeting's true purpose, while providing no actionable evidence I could use to defend myself. The conference room had been arranged to maximize psychological pressure, with Brandon positioned at the head of the table and other attendees scattered around the sides in a way that would force me to sit isolated at the far end. The setup was subtle but effective, creating a physical representation of the professional isolation he had constructed around me. As colleagues entered the room, their discomfort was palpable. Jessica Martinez offered a nervous smile, but quickly looked away when I tried to make eye contact. Gregory Thompson from Finance shuffled his papers unnecessarily and studied his notes with unusual intensity. Patricia Williams had positioned herself directly across from Brandon, ready to support whatever narrative he intended to present. The agenda for the meeting distributed that morning listed Department Efficiency Review and Resource Optimization as the primary topic, with personnel development and performance assessment as a secondary discussion point. The euphemistic language disguised what everyone understood to be a termination proceeding, disguised as routine management evaluation. At 9:25, Brandon called for everyone's attention and began with remarks about Sterling Technologies' continued growth and the importance of ensuring our human resources are aligned with our strategic objectives. His opening comments were professional and measured, designed to create an atmosphere of serious business discussion rather than personal confrontation. Over the past several months, I have been conducting comprehensive evaluations of our department's operational efficiency and individual performance metrics. He continued, consulting notes that I knew contained fabricated evidence and distorted interpretations of my work contributions. Today's discussion will focus on identifying areas where we can optimize our resource allocation and address performance concerns that have impacted our collective effectiveness. The psychological torture began with Brandon's systematic presentation of documentation showing my supposed failures and inadequacies. Each accusation was carefully crafted to sound reasonable and supported by evidence, even though the underlying facts had been manipulated or taken completely out of context. He referenced the Morrison Project timeline confusion that had never actually occurred, presented client feedback that had been selectively edited to remove positive comments about my contributions, and displayed productivity metrics that failed to account for the additional security measures I had implemented to protect company data from his espionage activities. My colleagues listened with expressions of growing concern and disappointment, believing they were witnessing the professional downfall of someone who had simply been overwhelmed by responsibilities beyond her capabilities. Brandon's manipulation was so skillful that even I felt momentarily guilty about performance issues that existed only in his fabricated narrative. The most painful aspect of the presentation was watching teammates who had once valued my contributions nod along with Brandon's distorted version of events. Michael, who had personally benefited from my coding assistance on multiple projects, remained silent as Brandon described my technical approaches as overly complicated and impractical for team implementation. Sarah, who had witnessed many of the incidents Brandon was misrepresenting, sat quietly as he described my communication challenges and resistance to collaborative feedback. Her willingness to remain silent while watching my professional execution demonstrated how thoroughly Brandon had convinced her that supporting me would somehow harm her own career prospects. As the character assassination continued, I realized that Brandon was not simply trying to justify my termination, but was sending a message to the entire team about the consequences of challenging his authority or questioning his decisions. My public humiliation would serve as a warning to other employees about the futility of resistance during his transformation of Sterling Technologies' culture. 23 minutes into the meeting, Brandon transitioned from documenting my supposed inadequacies to announcing his decision about my future with the company. Given the performance concerns I have outlined and the impact these issues have had on our team's effectiveness, I have concluded that Annabelle's position must be terminated effective immediately, he declared with theatrical solemnity. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with the weight of 3 years of dedicated work being dismissed and the relationships I had built being severed by someone who had spent months systematically destroying my reputation for his own advancement. As I prepared to respond with whatever dignity I could maintain, I noticed movement in the back corner of the conference room that I had not registered during Brandon's presentation. A familiar figure was sitting partially obscured by a large potted plant, holding a tablet and observing the proceedings with the quiet intensity that I remembered from rare company-wide meetings. Robert Sterling, the founder of Sterling Technologies, had been present for the entire character assassination. His presence meant that he had witnessed Brandon's manipulation firsthand, observed the systematic destruction of my reputation, and seen how effectively Brandon could turn colleagues against each other through calculated psychological pressure. The realization that Sterling had been watching the entire proceeding filled me with a complex mixture of hope and terror. Either he would recognize Brandon's manipulation and intervene to prevent an injustice, or he would support Brandon's decision and confirm that my career at Sterling Technologies was indeed over. As I stood to leave with whatever professional dignity I could preserve, Sterling's voice cut through the oppressive silence with 4 words that would transform everything. "Actually, Brandon, I think we need to talk." The transformation in the conference room's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic, like the moment when stage lights suddenly illuminate a theater that had been shrouded in darkness. Robert Sterling rose from his corner position with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, and every person in the room shifted their attention from Brandon's triumphant presentation to their founder's unexpected presence. Brandon's confident demeanor cracked visibly as he realized that his carefully orchestrated performance had been observed by the one person whose opinion could override his authority. His face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and panic as he struggled to maintain professional composure while processing the implications of Sterling's intervention.
"Robert, I didn't realize you were attending this meeting."
Brandon managed his voice, betraying uncertainty for the first time since I had known him.
"I was just concluding our department efficiency review and addressing some personnel challenges that have been impacting our operational effectiveness."
Sterling moved toward the conference table with deliberate steps, his presence commanding attention in a way that made Brandon's manufactured authority seem hollow by comparison. At 61 years old, Sterling possessed the kind of natural leadership that comes from decades of building successful companies and earning genuine respect rather than demanding it through manipulation.
"I've been here for the entire presentation, Brandon,"
Sterling replied calmly, his voice carrying implications that made everyone in the room understand that significant revelations were about to unfold.
"I found your performance evaluation particularly interesting, especially given what I know about Annabelle's actual contributions to this company." The recognition moment arrived when Sterling turned his attention directly to me, his expression mixing apology with respect as he began to acknowledge truths that Brandon had spent months distorting.
Annabelle, I believe we have never been formally introduced, but I have been following your work since before you joined Sterling Technologies.
The room fell completely silent as Sterling continued.
5 years ago, your security innovation saved Innovate Corp from bankruptcy and transformed their product into an industry standard. That breakthrough was what convinced me to track your career development and eventually bring you to our company.
My shock at learning about Sterling's long-term awareness of my work was compounded by the realization that my recruitment to Sterling Technologies had been personally orchestrated by someone who valued my innovations enough to monitor my professional progress across multiple companies. Brandon's expression shifted from panic to desperation as he recognized that his carefully constructed narrative about my inadequacies was being systematically dismantled by someone with access to information he had not anticipated.
Robert, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the current performance issues we've been addressing.
He began weakly.
There's no misunderstanding,
Sterling interrupted firmly.
For the past 6 months, I have been conducting a comprehensive investigation into activities that threaten the security and integrity of our company. Your behavior has been under continuous surveillance as part of a federal investigation into corporate espionage.
The revelation sent shockwaves through the room as colleagues began to understand that the meeting they thought was about my professional inadequacies was actually about exposing a sophisticated industrial espionage operation. Sterling's investigation had been monitoring Brandon's activities while using my persecution as unintentional cover for gathering evidence about his true agenda. Sterling continued his methodical dismantling of Brandon's deception, producing documentation that revealed the extent of federal surveillance and Brandon's connections to TechFlow Industries' systematic placement of corporate spies in competitor companies.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been building a case against TechFlow's espionage network for over 18 months, he explained.
Annabelle's security improvements and meticulous documentation of suspicious activities provided crucial evidence that helped federal investigators understand the scope and sophistication of the operation. Sterling added, acknowledging that my defensive measures had inadvertently contributed to the investigation that would ultimately vindicate my concerns. The evidence presentation was devastating in its thoroughness and precision. Sterling displayed recordings of Brandon's phone conversations with TechFlow executives discussing Sterling Technologies' client lists, proprietary algorithms, and strategic vulnerabilities. The conversations revealed not only corporate espionage, but also detailed plans for weakening our company to facilitate eventual acquisition. Brandon's desperate attempts to maintain his narrative crumbled as Sterling systematically addressed each accusation he had made against me.
The client retention algorithm Brandon presented to our board last month was actually developed entirely by Annabelle over a period of 6 months. The innovation represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we need to maintain our competitive advantage. My colleagues' expressions transformed from disappointment to horror as they realized how completely they had been manipulated into betraying someone who had consistently contributed to the company's success. Sarah's face showed particular anguish as she understood how her abandonment of our friendship had been engineered by someone exploiting her desire to avoid workplace conflict. Michael's confession came voluntarily and with visible shame as he addressed Sterling directly. Robert, I need to acknowledge that Brandon offered me Annabelle's position in exchange for undermining her projects and supporting his version of events. I chose career advancement over integrity, and I deeply regret my actions.
The broader conspiracy revelation showed how Brandon's placement at Sterling Technologies was part of a systematic federal investigation into TechFlow's corporate espionage network that had affected multiple companies across the technology industry. Federal authorities had been building cases against TechFlow executives for over a year, using Brandon's activities as evidence of their systematic approach to weakening competitors. Sterling's explanation of my unwitting role in the federal investigation was both validating and sobering. Annabelle's security improvements and documentation efforts provided the final evidence prosecutors needed to file charges against TechFlow's leadership. Her persistence in protecting company assets, despite facing professional persecution, demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity our industry needs. The room's atmosphere shifted dramatically as Sterling called for corporate security to escort Brandon from the building. Federal agents arrived within minutes to seize his devices and formally arrest him on charges related to industrial espionage and violation of federal computer fraud statutes. Brandon's final moments in the conference room were marked by desperate attempts to maintain innocence and claim that his activities represented legitimate competitive intelligence gathering. However, the evidence Sterling had presented made such claims obviously false, and federal agents efficiently removed him while he continued protesting his innocence. Sterling's personal apology to me was both professional and heartfelt, acknowledging that allowing me to suffer through months of persecution had been a necessary but regrettable aspect of the federal investigation. Annabelle, I owe you a sincere apology for allowing this situation to continue as long as it did. Your sacrifice helped protect not only our company, but the entire industry from systematic corporate espionage. The immediate aftermath in the conference room was characterized by a mixture of relief, shame, and determination to address the damage that had been done to team relationships and company culture. Sterling announced immediate measures to protect employees from retaliation and rebuild the trust that Brandon's manipulation had systematically destroyed. Colleague recalibration began immediately as team members started to understand the magnitude of their betrayal and the courage I had shown throughout months of professional persecution. The recognition that they had been manipulated into abandoning someone who was actually protecting the company created a collective sense of guilt and determination to make amends. As Sterling concluded the meeting and began planning the company's recovery from Brandon's sabotage, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and exhaustion. The truth had finally been revealed, but the emotional and professional damage would require significant time and effort to heal completely. The immediate aftermath of Brandon's removal transformed Sterling Technologies' conference room from a place of calculated humiliation into a space for honest reckoning and meaningful change. As federal agents concluded their evidence collection and Sterling began addressing the shocked team members, I experienced a profound shift from isolation to recognition that felt almost overwhelming after months of systematic persecution. Federal prosecutor Janet Morrison arrived within an hour to brief Sterling's leadership team about the broader implications of Brandon's arrest and TechFlow's industrial espionage network. Her presentation revealed that our company had been one of 7 firms targeted by TechFlow's systematic placement of corporate spies in competitor organizations. The evidence gathered from Sterling Technologies, particularly through Annabelle's security improvements and documentation efforts, provided the final pieces prosecutors needed to file comprehensive charges against TechFlow's executive leadership. Morrison explained to our assembled department heads, "This investigation represents one of the largest corporate espionage cases in federal history. The scope of TechFlow's activities was staggering in its ambition and sophistication. Over a 3-year period, they had systematically placed executives in leadership positions at companies representing over $2 billion in combined annual revenue. Their strategy involved weakening competitors through internal sabotage, while stealing innovations that could be integrated into TechFlow's own product development. My unwitting heroism in the federal investigation became clear as Morrison detailed how my security measures had prevented Brandon from accessing the most sensitive client data and proprietary algorithms. Annabelle's defensive actions essentially limited the damage TechFlow could inflict while providing investigators with detailed documentation of their attempted espionage activities. The personal cost acknowledgement from Sterling was both validating and emotionally complex. While I appreciated his recognition that my persecution had been unfair, I struggled with the knowledge that my suffering had been allowed to continue for months to serve the broader investigation's needs. Sterling's commitment to making amends was immediate and comprehensive. He announced the establishment of a fund to compensate employees who had been affected by Brandon's manipulation-enhanced security protocols to prevent future espionage attempts and mandatory training programs about recognizing and reporting suspicious activities. Sarah's breakdown and apology was perhaps the most emotionally challenging aspect of the day's revelations. My former best friend approached me after Morrison's briefing with tears streaming down her face and a vulnerability I had never seen from her before. "Annabelle, I cannot adequately express how ashamed I am of abandoning our friendship when you needed support most," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Brandon convinced me that supporting you would somehow damage my career, and I chose self-preservation over loyalty to someone who had always been honest with me." Her confession revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation Brandon had employed to turn colleagues against me. He had convinced Sarah that my security concerns represented paranoid thinking that could damage team morale, and that distancing herself from me would demonstrate mature leadership judgment. Michael's restitution efforts began immediately with a company-wide email acknowledging that innovations attributed to Brandon had actually been developed by me. His public confession was professionally damaging to his own reputation, but represented a crucial step toward restoring accuracy to our project documentation. I want to formally acknowledge that the client retention algorithm presented to our board was entirely conceived and developed by Annabelle Richardson. Michael wrote to all Sterling Technologies employees, "My failure to correct this misattribution when it occurred represents a serious lapse in professional integrity that I deeply regret." The department healing process required Sterling to facilitate several honest discussions about how psychological manipulation tactics had successfully divided our previously collaborative team. These conversations were uncomfortable, but necessary for understanding how individual insecurities and ambitions had been exploited to create conflict where none had previously existed. Industry impact became apparent as news of TechFlow's federal indictment spread throughout the technology sector. Multiple companies began reviewing their own security protocols and investigating whether they had experienced similar infiltration attempts. The case became a watershed moment for corporate cybersecurity and employee background verification procedures. Client relationship restoration required Sterling to personally contact our major accounts to explain the situation and reassure them about the security of their data. His conversations with clients consistently emphasized my role in protecting their information and preventing more serious breaches from occurring. The recognition was deeply gratifying but also overwhelming after months of having my contributions dismissed and distorted. Industry publications began featuring articles about my security innovations and the role my defensive measures had played in exposing corporate espionage. Conference organizers invited me to speak about identifying and preventing workplace manipulation. Sterling's offer of Brandon's director position came with full autonomy, substantial salary increases, and resources to implement whatever changes I felt necessary to prevent future incidents. However, accepting the role Brandon had vacated felt insufficient given what I had learned about systemic vulnerabilities in corporate culture and employee protection. My counteroffer surprised Sterling with its ambition and vision. Instead of simply replacing Brandon, I proposed creating an entirely new position focused on ethical leadership, corporate culture, and employee protection systems that would address the root causes that had made Brandon's manipulation possible. What happened to me could happen to any employee who threatens someone with manipulative skills and unethical intentions. I explained to Sterling during our private discussion about my future role. We need systemic changes that make psychological manipulation impossible rather than simply hoping to hire better people. The vision for transformation I presented involved democratizing decision-making processes, creating transparency measures that would expose attempts at manipulation, and establishing protection systems for employees who identified potential threats to company security or integrity. Sterling's admiration for my approach was evident in his immediate approval of the new position and his request for me to develop comprehensive proposals for company-wide cultural changes. He recognized that my experience had provided unique insights into corporate vulnerabilities that could benefit the entire organization. The Chief Culture and Ethics Officer position we created represented a fundamental shift in how Sterling Technologies approached employee relations and organizational integrity. My authority to implement company-wide changes and investigate potential manipulation or abuse created accountability systems that had not previously existed. Innovation protection became a cornerstone of the new policies I developed, ensuring that individual contributions would be properly documented, credited, and defended against theft or misattribution. The systems we implemented made it virtually impossible for future executives to steal employee innovations without detection. Employee protection protocols included training programs to help staff recognize manipulation tactics, anonymous reporting systems for suspicious activities, and advocates who could support employees facing workplace persecution. The goal was creating an environment where people like Brandon could not successfully isolate and destroy individual employees. Cultural shift implementation began with company-wide workshops about authentic leadership versus manipulative authority, collaborative problem-solving techniques, and the importance of supporting colleagues during difficult situations rather than abandoning them to protect personal interests. Personal growth recognition came through understanding how my experience with Brandon had taught me to distinguish between authentic relationships based on mutual respect and manipulative interactions designed to exploit trust for personal advantage. The knowledge would prove invaluable throughout my future career. The ripple effect throughout Sterling Technologies was profound as employees who had previously remained silent began sharing their own experiences with Brandon's manipulation tactics. Their stories revealed that my persecution had been part of a broader pattern of psychological abuse that had affected multiple team members in different ways. 6 months after Brandon's removal, Sterling Technologies had transformed into a model of ethical leadership and collaborative innovation that attracted attention from across the industry. Our approach to employee protection and authentic culture development became a template that other companies began studying and implementing. 18 months after that devastating March morning when Brandon Walsh attempted to destroy my career in a corporate conference room, I stood at the podium of the Chicago Convention Center, addressing over 800 technology leaders about the critical importance of ethical leadership and employee protection in modern corporate environments. The transformation of Sterling Technologies under my ethical leadership initiatives had exceeded every expectation that Robert Sterling and I had discussed when creating my new role. Our company had become an industry model for authentic culture development, collaborative innovation, and systematic protection of employees from workplace manipulation and abuse. Federal prosecutor Janet Morrison's case against TechFlow Industries had concluded with convictions on multiple counts of corporate espionage, computer fraud, and conspiracy charges that resulted in substantial prison sentences for 7 executives and over $50 million in fines and restitution payments. The precedent established by the prosecution had fundamentally changed how federal authorities approached corporate espionage investigations. Brandon Walsh himself received a 6-year federal prison sentence after pleading guilty to charges related to industrial espionage and theft of proprietary information. During his sentencing hearing, federal prosecutors presented evidence showing that his activities at Sterling Technologies represented only the most recent example of a systematic pattern of corporate sabotage that had affected multiple companies over nearly a decade. Industry recognition of my role in exposing and preventing corporate espionage had led to numerous awards and speaking opportunities that established me as a thought leader in workplace ethics and security innovation. The Chicago Technology Council named me Professional of the Year, and Harvard Business School developed a case study based on Sterling Technologies' cultural transformation. Personal relationship restoration with Sarah had required months of honest communication and trust rebuilding, but our friendship had ultimately emerged stronger than before the crisis. Sarah's experience with Brandon's manipulation had motivated her to become an advocate for authentic workplace relationships and collaborative problem-solving approaches. Learning how easily I was turned against someone I cared about was a devastating revelation about my own character. Sarah explained during a panel discussion we presented together about recognizing and resisting workplace manipulation. The experience taught me that supporting colleagues during difficult times requires moral courage, not just professional courtesy. Michael Rodriguez had undergone the most dramatic personal transformation of anyone affected by Brandon's manipulation. His public acknowledgement of betraying me for career advancement had damaged his reputation initially, but his subsequent commitment to ethical leadership and his advocacy for transparent innovation attribution had gradually restored colleague respect and trust. Team dynamics at Sterling Technologies had evolved into what industry observers called a gold standard for collaborative innovation and mutual support. Our department's creative output had increased by over 60% since implementing democratic decision-making processes and transparency measures that prevented any individual from dominating or manipulating team discussions. Sterling Technologies' client base had not only remained loyal throughout the corporate espionage crisis, but had actually expanded as word spread about our company's commitment to data security and ethical business practices. Major corporations began choosing us specifically because of our demonstrated ability to protect confidential information and maintain integrity under pressure. Employee satisfaction metrics showed unprecedented improvements across every category measured by our annual surveys. Staff turnover had decreased to nearly zero, productivity had increased substantially, and anonymous feedback consistently praised the authentic leadership culture and collaborative problem-solving approaches that had replaced Brandon's manipulative management style. The mentorship programs I established had become one of Sterling Technologies' most successful initiatives, pairing experienced employees with junior staff members to provide guidance, support, and protection against potential exploitation or manipulation. The program had prevented several situations where new employees might have been vulnerable to psychological pressure or professional sabotage. Educational impact extended far beyond Sterling Technologies, as business schools across the country began incorporating lessons from our cultural transformation into their leadership and ethics curricula. Students studied how systematic manipulation could undermine workplace effectiveness and learned strategies for creating environments that supported authentic collaboration rather than political maneuvering. My role had evolved beyond Chief Culture and Ethics Officer to include consulting with other companies facing similar challenges with toxic leadership, corporate espionage concerns, or systematic workplace manipulation. The insights gained from surviving and overcoming Brandon's campaign had proven valuable to organizations struggling with trust communication and integrity issues. Community involvement had become a personal passion as I developed workshops and resources to help professionals in various industries recognize and resist psychological manipulation in workplace settings. The knowledge that my painful experience could protect others from similar persecution provided deep satisfaction and purpose to my career development. Federal testimony in subsequent corporate espionage cases had established important legal precedents for protecting employees who reported suspicious activities and for prosecuting executives who engaged in systematic manipulation and theft of proprietary information. My experience had contributed to strengthening laws that protected corporate whistleblowers and expanded definitions of workplace harassment. Sterling Technologies' influence on industry practices had grown substantially with our employee protection protocols and ethical leadership training programs being adopted by companies across multiple sectors. The transformation from a target of corporate espionage to a model of integrity and innovation had captured attention from business leaders worldwide. Writing projects had emerged naturally from speaking engagements and consulting work as I developed articles and resources about maintaining professional integrity during adversity, recognizing sophisticated manipulation tactics, and creating workplace cultures that supported authentic collaboration rather than political competition. The biggest revelation from my journey had been understanding how temporary pain from standing up to injustice could create lasting positive change that extended far beyond personal vindication. The worst professional experience of my life had become the foundation for my most meaningful career achievements and contributions to workplace ethics. Relationship wisdom gained through the crisis had taught me to distinguish between people who support you during success versus those who stand by you during difficulties. Authentic relationships survive periods of stress and uncertainty, while manipulative connections dissolve when continuing them requires moral courage or personal sacrifice. Personal fulfillment came from work that combined technical innovation with protecting others from the kind of systematic persecution I had endured. Each employee who avoided manipulation because of systems we implemented, each company that strengthened its ethical culture based on our model, and each student who learned to recognize workplace abuse represented victories that transcended my individual recovery. The ultimate life lesson emerged through months of reflection on how Brandon's sabotage had ultimately strengthened both my character and my professional impact. Sometimes the greatest acts of betrayal against us become the foundation for our most important contributions to others. When we refuse to let injustice break us, we develop the strength to ensure others never have to endure what we survived. As I concluded my presentation at the Chicago Convention Center, looking out at an audience of professionals who were learning to create workplaces built on integrity rather than manipulation, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment of purpose and impact. Today, Sterling Technologies stands as proof that companies can choose ethical leadership over political maneuvering, collaborative innovation over competitive sabotage, and authentic relationships over manipulative control. The transformation began with one employee's refusal to accept injustice quietly and grew into a movement that continues changing how we think about workplace culture and professional integrity. My experience with Brandon Walsh taught me that individual courage during adversity can create positive change that extends far beyond personal vindication. When we choose truth over convenience and integrity over advancement, we plant seeds for transformations that can protect countless others from the manipulation and abuse we overcame. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where standing up for what's right felt impossible because everyone around you seemed to be against you? How did you find the courage to maintain your integrity when doing so might have cost you everything you had worked to achieve? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about times when you had to choose between personal safety and doing what you knew was right. Please like this video. If my story resonated with you, subscribe for more content about workplace ethics and authentic leadership, and share this with anyone who might need encouragement to stand up against injustice in their own professional life. Thank you for listening to my journey from persecution to purpose. I hope it reminds you that temporary pain from fighting injustice can become the foundation for lasting positive change in your life and the lives of others. May you always find the strength to choose integrity over convenience, and may your courage inspire others to do the same.